Hello and welcome to Compounding Curiosity. I'm your host Kalani Scarrett, and this podcast is all about compounding your curiosity alongside my own through thoughtful interviews with interesting guests. For transcripts and detailed show notes, check out the links in the description. Hopefully you're as keen as me to learn something new, so let's get stuck in. So my guest today is Max Koh. Max is a private investor from Singapore with a background and history in marketing. So for today's conversation, we cover how marketing and investing often intertwine, some interesting ways that he researches a company, and some lessons he's learned along the way. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Max Koh. Max, thanks so much for being on today. But our previous podcast guest, Eugene, connected us, and he mentioned that you have a really interesting background. So before we get into investing and all the like, I'd love just to hear more about you and your background.
Got it. Yeah. Firstly, thank you for having me, right, Kalani? So I think my background is something that it's very different from the conventional investing path. Because I've heard a few of your podcasts, and normally standard podcasts, most people in the investing world have a investing background. Like they've always wanted to be investors since young, manage their own funds, what have you. Mine's a little different. So I come from the marketing background. So since young, I've always had a passion for, I would say, speaking and marketing. So like the element of persuasion. So when I was like a little boy, about 15 or 16, I came across like as cheesy and as trite as it sounds, I came across like videos of Tony Robbins speaking on stage. Like, you know Tony Robbins, right? So that was the first time in my life I was like, whoa, like you can be a speaker on stage, make people laugh, tell stories, and make such good money. And I was like, okay, I want to do that. So I went into the marketing rabbit hole, became a marketer and a speaker. So that's how I built my chops in speaking, because I was teaching people on marketing. And then of course through my seminars and talks, through a company that I'm with. So I don't run my own business. It's through like a seminar company here based in Singapore, where I'm based from, and then gave me a platform to start speaking. And then through there, that was how I kind of, I would say, accumulated my first pots of gold, which is I was able to save my first 6 figures through my work and my employment, and as a speaker and as a middle level manager in a small medium business in Singapore. And then from there, the questions start coming up, and that is, oh no, the bank account interest rates in Singapore, I believe in the whole world, are crap. I'm never gonna grow my income, my wealth, what have you. And so I was thinking to myself, okay, I gotta do something to to try and make it grow. And believe it or not, I didn't consider investing at the start, because since young I've never really felt that was the path for me. I've always loved stuff that have a bit more action, a bit more kind of excitement to it. So after having my first 6 figures saved up, along the way back then as well, I was already exploring things like, believe it or not, forex trading, price action, looking at charts, technical analysis, what have you, futures trading, commodities trading. And I didn't lose much money, but I didn't make much money as well. But it was fun because some backstory, I love playing poker. So I guess trading has a bit of that essence of poker there, where the risk reward is being managed, and then you kind of ride the trend, like kind of like the flop the river. If you have a good hand, you go all in, kind of stuff like that. So that was me for like about 2 years or so, and then obviously no results from my trading and the more short-term price action. And it's only about 3 years ago that I kind of had this I was just brought to a corner where I've tried almost everything. So I just kind of gave like the condensed version of the story, but like I tried like forex, didn't work, futures didn't work, even I wanted to invest in a property in Singapore, but even I didn't go through because I was just very afraid of getting my money stuck there, because I think, as you know, like property, pretty much it's quite illiquid, right? So almost all other options were exhausted, and just out of pure desperation, I was like, okay, the only thing I haven't yet tried is investing. I mean, I've heard about Warren Buffett since young, who hasn't, right? But I just didn't want to do it, because I've always had this fear that I've got to read like a ton of reports, and I've got to pour through all the statements, and I was a bit afraid of that. And then so out of just pure desperation, having exhausted all the other options, I was like, okay, crap, let's just try investing. And so I started attending courses and seminars on that in 2019, early 2019. Yep, so it's been about 3 years. And here's the funny thing. after I started attending courses, I think I got really lucky as well. I learned from the right people at the very beginning, because I started attending courses on growth investing at the very beginning. There's this well-known investor here in Singapore. His name is called Kelvin Sito. That's the guy that I first learned from. I believe he's quite popular on Twitter. In fact, if you can, do interview him, and this guy is my mentor. And so after coming across his course and learning about growth investing, I was pretty mind blown, because some backstory is that I'm a big nerd. I think you can tell through the camera, but yeah, the viewers or the listeners won't see it. But I'm a big nerd in the sense that since young, due to like Tony Robbins and all that stuff that I was exposed to, I'm a big, what we call like a self-help junkie. So you know what that means, right? It means you attend seminars, I read a ton of books, and I've just loved reading. And it's only when I chanced upon investing and I was taught how to read the annual report and look at financial statements, I was like, I don't know whether I can swear, but I was like, holy shit, like this is amazing. Like because I was always fearful on the surface of like having to read a lot, but then when I actually read it, I was like, oh, this ties into my personality of that love and hunger for reading, because I'm the kind of person where since young I've always loved to just read and learn and grow. I'm a self-help junkie, right, like I mentioned. And so because of that, when I first learned how to read annual reports, I was like, okay, this is such an amazing outlet. Since young I've always loved reading, but I could never really transform that into like a money-making avenue, right? And then when I learned how to like really analyze financial statements, understand about the business, the 10K, the 10Qs, the business section, read the S1s, what have you. It was like I got bitten by the investing bug, if that's what you call it. And then I was just madly obsessed. And then since then till now, can't stop reading annual reports or S1s, prospectus, what have you. And so that was how I discovered that, holy shit, like this investing thing actually fits my personality, and it actually gives me an outlet to read and learn about the world and yet still make pretty good money. So I think to kind of end off my long-winded story is that there's this quote that I came across just last year after coming across Nick Sleep's letters, right? So he has this quote at the beginning of his letter before he was introducing the whole letter before he went into the breakdown of the year by year. He said that investing is one of those rare fields where as a capital allocator, you can just get paid really good money just to learn and to think about the world. And when I read that, I was so inspired because that really resonated with what I really felt, and he was able to word it in such a beautiful way. So yeah, that's how I got bitten by the investing bug. And then from Kelvin Sito, from there he started me on the path of growth investing, which is investing in companies with growth. So I was very fortunate I didn't spend much time in any of that deep value cigar, but I did a bit of that when I was exploring. But thankfully at the very beginning of the journey, the right mentors, the right framework, and then I went down the whole rabbit hole of Motley Fool and like reading investor letters, John Huber, Fred Liu, a whole bunch of well-known investors, Buffett definitely, all his transcripts of the annual meetings, and just that got me started. And I think the biggest, I would say, learning journey was actually last year during COVID. I think we all know what happened to the whole wide world. Everyone was on what we call a lockdown or shelter in place. And so for most people I know, it's a very unfortunate, it's a very unpleasant experience to be tied down at home. But I would say that 4 months of being stuck at home, I think it was like March, April, May, that period last year, 2020, was like a period of renaissance for me, right? So, because you can't go out, and my job, because I do a lot of speaking and seminars, I used to have to travel like at least once a month. So that was the only time I was stuck at home reading, and it may sound like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. I felt so happy and blissful every day because after work, because it's all working from home, right? After work ends, you didn't need to travel. My work starts at 10 a.m. It would end about 8 p.m. And then from 8 p.m. to like 12 a.m., I would just, guess what? Read 10Ks and S1s the whole way through, go to bed, next day wake up, do a bit of exercise, start work, and then do the same thing for 4 months on end. And now looking back, because right now the world has kind of opened up, so I'm required to travel to the office once in a while. But that period of just because you can't go out, you can't meet your friends, was the best learning. Like, it really accelerated my growth as an investor and made me learn so much in that period. So, yep, that's my journey. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. And taking the positive out of a bad situation, that's awesome. But it's funny how investing was probably your last option and it's ended up being the best option.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there any lessons applicable from marketing, do you think? Like, was there any transfers, or were you starting from scratch when you started investing, do you reckon?
I would say yes, there is, and that's why I think the way I invest is pretty different. So I think the one big thing I learned as a marketer or in my marketing background is the importance of psychology, right? So psychology, not just in terms of the consumer psychology. So we can talk about that in a while, which is the way I analyze a business has a lot to do with the qualitative side. I like to look at the consumer psychology, but I think the bigger aspect behind that is the personal psychology, which is the psychology of the investor. Because marketing, you learn a lot about psychology, and so what has transferred over is the way I invest. I place a lot of emphasis on my psychology. So just to share some weird habits of mine that will seem outright just ridiculous. For example, on the weekdays, I never ever check stock prices. Unless the market is in like deep red, then I just go in to buy because then I can't resist. But I never ever check stock prices. And the reason being that I feel that every time you check a stock price on the weekdays, it's kind of like a call to action for you to need to go and do something, optimize something that may or may not be the best for your long-term portfolio returns. So I don't check stock prices to the point where if I have friends, when we go for dinner and if I'm close with them and they tell me something like, hey Max, do you know this stock has kind of had this price or dropped by this amount, I'll get pissed off. I'm like, no, don't tell me about that. You're gonna mess with my ownership mentality mindset. So that psychology, I believe a lot in trying to protect myself and have an environment that doesn't mess with my mind. That's one. Secondly, is that another thing I learned from the marketing area, and that is like the way I look at a business. I'm trying to adopt the ownership mentality. And similar to what I learned in marketing, right? Like, everything is all about how you kind of persuade people, how you persuade yourself. So, which means that the words that you use can affect the prospect in the marketing world. Similarly, the words that I use will affect myself. So, also borderline ridiculous, probably going to get laughed at. When I speak to friends, of course, in such a podcast, I have to use these terms. When I speak to friends in my normal daily life, you will never ever hear me using the word stock. I like to use the word business, so it sounds like stupid. Like when I ask my friend, hey, did you check out this business? Like, you can just say, hey, did you check out the Facebook stock? I would go like a big round and say, did you check out this business? And instead of saying like I bought a stock, I would say, hey, you know what, I have a participation in this business, which sounds stupid, but I just want to be able to tune my mind to speak like an owner because of my long-term investing philosophy. So that's another thing I learned from marketing that I carried over. That is the languaging that I use affects my belief systems. And so yeah, I tie in a lot of my investing style with the mental, what we call the meta aspect of it. So hopefully that answers the question.
So you spoke a little about investor psychology. Could you talk maybe about customer psychology and what you look for, and then maybe what maybe you pick up that other people don't, do you reckon?
Yeah, so the customer psychology thing is, yeah, as usual, because of my marketing background, but to also, I think, give full credit where it's due, there were actually a few investors I learned from that really firmed up or helped me to develop this side of my investing style, and that is I place a lot of emphasis on customer love and assessing whether customers really like a product or service. In other words, what we call the value proposition. So back then in my early days in marketing, we are always taught to think in terms of stuff like USP or what's a unique value proposition or all stuff like that. So a few investors that really honed that into me was actually two people. Number one is this investor known as John Huber. I'm sure you've heard of him, Saber Capital. So he has amazing letters. His blog, I believe, his blog, which is Saber Capital as well, he shares a lot about back then. Over the years, he has like articles on like Apple, and back then when John Huber was buying. So he's a believer in buying like a bit of the safer businesses, but he still believes that these big businesses can still make alpha. And back then when he bought Apple, it was where the market was selling off Apple because the numbers of the iPhone sales were doing terrible. So it seems like Apple's only relying on the iPhone, and the iPhone was starting to go down or stagnate. So that's why the stock got sold off. I believe it was in mid 2018, about there. And so, or was it 2019? Yeah, right. I think it's mid 2018. And then he started buying Apple back then because he said that Apple, a lot of people back then, they only saw Apple as a consumer tech, like a company that just sells phones or hardware. But if you actually look at it closely, Apple is actually a brand, which we all now know, we all know that today. But Apple is actually a brand, and when you look at the consumer psychology, the love for the phones, the long queues outside the Apple store before a new phone is launched, that allowed him to see Apple for what it really is, and allowed him to take a huge position in Apple. And of course, today the market has obviously corrected that mistake, and he has made quite a fair bit of alpha from that position. So that's one. Another investor that I learned a lot from as well is actually this, I would say, I think he's retired. His name is called Alan Mackham. Right, so Alan Mackham, I believe he runs this fund known as like Arlington Value. So same thing, it's from him that I learned how to analyze a company based on the consumer psychology, like whether people love it, whether customers want to come back over and over again. So I think based off this, it's probably no surprise that most of the companies that I analyze or invest are in the consumer space, because I can look at reviews. A lot of my due diligence is I love it because I get to watch YouTube videos of people reviewing products, which I can't do for like a B2B business, right? And so that's how I invest, and that's how I form my initial, I would say, philosophy based on consumer habits and psychology.
For idea generation, one interesting maybe point, when I've interviewed Singaporean investors, they're much more willing to invest abroad because obviously Singapore is so small.
Yeah.
So when it comes to idea generation, is it just reviews? What are you looking for?
So you mean like, how do I find possible businesses to invest? Is that right?
Yeah, especially when sometimes you don't have boots on the ground compared to, say, someone in Silicon Valley.
So I think the simplest answer, which we all know, it's actually Twitter. So Twitter is a freaking fire hose, right? like it's also a place where you can watch fights and eat popcorn and see how debates play out. But yeah, I get a lot of the ideas through there by following, or I would say curating my Twitter feed to have great investors that bring up ideas and who constantly argue, debate, fight, what have you about ideas. So it gives me multiple perspectives. I'm also subscribed to, I would say, the Motley Fool, and I'm also part of a investing community in Singapore. So that gives me the idea flow. Also, maybe you might be wondering, like, do I use any screens? No, I don't use any screens. In my earlier days, yes, I would filter for, like revenue growth, how many percent, and then it cannot have a PE or PS ratio, or like the enterprise value to sales ratio, what have you, all these numbers. But then I realized, or maybe I suck at it, that was useless, because it will always either bring up the value traps, or it would bring up businesses that are great, but it just fails all the valuation metrics because it's at nosebleed valuations, right? So I realized that I'm doing the wrong way. I should be focusing first and foremost on the business idea and quality, only then worry about valuation. So I would wish to give like a textbook formula where I put in A and then I get out B and C, but I don't have that. It's a mixture of serendipity, luck, randomness, and just being on Twitter all day as an excuse. But that gets investment ideas. Yep.
And in terms of investing lessons, maybe a painful one. I know you've mentioned Peloton before, we've chatted about. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you learned from that?
Yeah, got it. So I think I'll give a bit of backstory first regarding why I invested, so that there's some context, because otherwise if I just go straight for the mistake, then it wouldn't make sense. So I first chanced upon Peloton early last year, around May 2020. That was the Renaissance time I was chatting about. So I had a lot of time to read annual reports, watch videos, what have you, and I came across Peloton. I forgot, someone on Twitter shared it probably. And just to give some background myself, I'm a gym junkie. So I think now you can see the kind of similarity. So I like to invest in companies where I actually understand the product and I have certain levels of knowledge of the industry. So in my case, I understand fitness, working out. I've been doing it for the last 10 years consistently. So I know the psychology or the psyche of someone who works out. So Peloton was on my radar. So the reason I started investing in it was because of mainly two reasons. Number one was the customer love for the product. So as usual, my due diligence process or scuttlebutt, what we call that, would involve watching a lot of videos, going to Twitter and checking out customers who buy the products. So I'll type in the keyword and variations of the keyword with certain phrases like OMG Peloton or like got Peloton, full Peloton, to see whether like things are sold out, what have you. So variations of that. And so I would do all these research on forums, Facebook groups, which Peloton has a big one, and I've noticed that people are so in love. And like, I think the only time I see a word like the word is called cult being used on a product it's only two companies that I'm aware of. Number one is Apple. Number two is Tesla, right? So Tesla and its Tesla bulls. Number three was Peloton. They had the same amount of raving, fanatical, culticism, what have you, around the product. So I'll just give you an example. Like I see, put the YouTube videos aside, just look at their Facebook group, and it's a free Facebook group, so anyone listening can just go join it. You see people who, like, I'll give an example. After their mother passed away, after their kids, for some unfortunate reason, maybe died in a fire whatsoever, they will put a photo of their loved ones, their kids or their husband or their mom that died from cancer, whatever, on the Facebook group and say, hey guys, today I'm going to write at 5 a.m. with this and that instructor, blah, blah, blah. Please send me the love. So I see so much love from the customer for the product, and yet so much of their life is linked to Peloton. Like, so yeah, it's really such a community where there's such, I would call spiritual, I don't know whether that's the best word, links with the product in terms of them getting happiness from that. So that kind of made me feel, okay, this is really quite interesting. And the second thing to put, because all these are very qualitative, to put the numbers to match the qualitative stuff, they have a net promoter score of close to 90. I think that's pretty much unheard of. So it's these numbers that I look at. And then, of course, back then when I invested, the Google Trends was increasing because of COVID. Everyone stuck at home. I started taking an initial position and started building the position along the way. So I think we all know how Peloton did in last year in 2020. Phenomenal. So very lucky. I sized the position okay. So everything was meant to be a nice, perfect ending until I think, so we're going to talk about mistakes, right? So that was why I started to enter the position. In end of 2020, which is last year, December, so it's about 1 year ago, they acquired this company known as Precor. So Precor is a company that's very big in the States that sells exercise bikes. And I know Precor because, like I mentioned, I've been in the gym for my whole last 10 years. And Precor is a very well-known exercise company that sells treadmills, exercise bikes, what have you, all these machines and equipment. They acquired Precor. So in my mind, I was like, so that was when the overly optimistic side started getting the better of me. Like, okay, Peloton's already dominating. They have such huge customer love in the consumer space. With Precor, their plans they announced back then was to go into the B2B space. So to sell like treadmills to hotels, commercial staff, to even like to companies and offices, what have you. So in my mind, I was really painting all that rosy pictures. Okay, they own the consumer space. They're going to dominate the B2B space. We're going to take over the world. And that was the point where the mistakes came in, because I went in heavy, or to give the better phrase, I backed up the truck in December and I totally threw valuations out. So before that, when I entered my position from mid last year all the way to December, I was still pretty disciplined. But in December, the whole logic just threw out and I just backed up the truck. And of course, that kind of pushed up my whole average price. And then of course, earlier, I think 2 months, was it last month, I think the business crashed, the stock crashed by 50% due to the business execution issues. And then that was obviously a painful thing for me, because I have a pretty concentrated portfolio, mainly because I like to invest only in companies that I understand. So I don't have a big circle of competence, right? So it's because of that I took a hit on that, and so that was a painful lesson. And people ask me, Max, looking back, what's the lesson here? I would love to say, right, like Kalani, I love to say, my mistake was that, I kind of miscalculated the company. It was not a good product after all, or my valuations were off. But actually that's not true, because I did a lot of heavy research on the financials, the modeling, the valuations. But the big mistake here, unfortunately or fortunately, is actually not the business. It's in my position sizing. Yeah, so because my sizing was disciplined all the way until year end, where I overly sized it and it went up all the way, the average price was pushed up. Because if I asked myself, hey Max, what if I had sized that position well as well? Would the stock price still crash? Yes, I couldn't have seen it coming. It would still have crashed, but I would have been able to at least get out at like a break-even price, because my average price was close to like $50 back then, $50-$60. So I wouldn't have lost much, or maybe slight loss or a break-even. But when just to give some context, when I entered heavy in December, the stock price was at an all-time high. I mean, I wouldn't know that's the all-time high back then, of like $160. And as we are speaking right now, it's, I think, $40. So you know how it went. So that was really my biggest lesson. So I keep asking myself, Max, where did the mistake go? And I keep thinking, I wish I could say it's the business, the valuations, but it wasn't. It's actually just in my position sizing and me losing my buying discipline. And till today, honestly, I'm still pissed at myself, but we live and learn. Yeah.
And so, position sizing. And do you think psychology plays a little bit in that as well, getting a bit excited maybe? Or how do you combat that in the future then, do you reckon?
Yeah, so I don't have the perfect answer, because I've always been a more optimistically driven person. So I like to see the good side of things. So I don't have an answer as to how to combat that, because I did ask myself this question that you asked me, right, Kalani? Because my normal research process, I also write a thesis. So the normal conventional argument would be, hey, when you write something out, it forces you to look at your ideas. So when they acquired Precor, I also wrote out the thesis. So I was like, how could I have avoided that? I can't really find a solution. So I don't have the best answer to that question, unfortunately. It's just me and my weakness right now. It's just, hopefully this awareness just makes me a bit more intentional in the future.
Yeah, fair enough. And so we've talked about how you find investments and what you enjoy, but to do the flip side, is there anything you totally avoid, will not touch? Like, what's the opposite of a good investment for you?
Yeah, I would say it's the typical, because given my small circle of competence, it's the very usual biotech, pharmaceuticals. Those are things that I avoid. But I think to kind of flip the question around, it's more like, and I first learned this from this investor that I have a lot of respect for. His name is called Bruce Greenwald. So he's a professor at the Columbia Business School. I think he stopped teaching there already. He used to teach value investing for a long time. And he had this concept that's called specialization. And most people would say, oh yeah, that's nothing new. It's circle of competence. But no, not really. So his philosophy is that you should only invest in businesses that not only are they within your circle of competence, but you know them so well. It's kind of like a specialization. So he gave a few examples. You can find this on YouTube. There's a lot of YouTube videos on this topic known as specialization. He gave the example when back then Buffett used to buy stuff like, banks, financials, consumer durables and stuff like that. But he gave the argument, which maybe it may not be accurate today because that video was recorded a long time back, that Buffett made his best, even though Buffett has a stellar track record, but Buffett, despite his stellar track record, he made his best investment results from the businesses that he understood the best, which were mainly banks and consumer durables. Of course, today things might have changed because he bought Snowflake, what have you. But my point is, when I first read that, I was like, oh, that is so true. So to answer your question in a slightly different way, I don't intentionally think of businesses to avoid, but I intentionally think of businesses that I know really, really well. So in my case, because it's marketing, e-commerce, I think it's no surprise that my portfolio consists mainly of companies in e-commerce, in digital advertising, and of course, fitness.
To maybe come back to a point you mentioned earlier about your research process, and I really enjoyed how you said on Twitter you were searching specific phrases and whatnot. Is there any other strange research processes that you do? Like, I'm always interested in how people do things differently, I guess.
Yes, there is. So let me just, that's a very good question. You're going to make me share with the world how weird I am. But so believe it or not, a lot of people, even though I keep talking about quality, the first thing that I do whenever I start to get curious in a company is I will actually watch interviews of the founder. And yeah, most people would say, yeah, big, but nothing strange with that. You gotta know the management. But here's a bit different. What I like to look for, or like kind of, at least for now, my current investing style, it might evolve in the future, is I like to find a founder that can impress me. Only if it impresses me, then I start the research process. So for example, Peloton, it was John Foley, which is the founder. After seeing his story of getting rejected by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of VCs, eventually starting at Peloton, I was in awe of how much grit and resilience that guy has. To give a bit of clarity as well, last year a company that I was in love with, which thankfully I don't own now, was actually Zoom. So a lot of people say, yeah, Zoom, I mean, nothing special. Obviously you can see that growth is going up, but no, I didn't invest because of the growth. I invested mainly because the founder, Eric Yuan, was extremely passionate about his business, and he was even replying to customer emails himself. So I always use people. Maybe it's because of my marketing background, so it's always psychology. I always use people as the starting point. Only if I like the founder and the story excites me, then I go do the financial models, build the numbers and the quantitative stuff, and then start looking at the customer reviews. So I always start with the founder, which is a bit different from, I guess, how most people start, because my guess is most people would either use the annual report or build a model first and stuff like that. So yeah, that's another weird way that I research.
Yeah, so I think probably the next logical question is, what makes an interesting founder? Like, is it the passion? What are you looking for in a founder?
Yeah, to give full credit as well, I first initially, because when I was a lot newer, it was just stories that excite me. But in the last 1.5 years, I learned from this investor. His name is called Michael Shen. I believe he's quite popular. He has this book known as the Investment Checklist. But I would recommend that people watch his video interview with, I believe it was Tom Gardner, the co-founder of Motley Fool, where he shares his research process. So this guy is a heavily founder-based investor. He's always looking for founders, and that gave me a nice framework to kind of flesh out my thought process into a more, I would say, tangible framework. So mainly 3 things I look for in founders when I want to invest. Number 1, I must learn something from their interviews or their earnings transcripts. What do I mean by that? I mean, so I give an example. Like most earnings transcripts, when you look through, you learn something about the business or how it's doing, but you seldom learn something. And he gave the example of, I think he's probably like a Toby Lutke fanboy, so am I. And so he gave the example, and I went to read back. So he said that good founders, you learn something from every earnings transcript, and lo and behold, it was true. If you actually look at Shopify's transcripts when Toby's actually speaking, not only is he answering the questions that the analyst asked about the business, he's actually teaching you something. For example, I'll give a more specific example. I believe it was sometime last year, I think it was Q4 or Q3 2020, the earnings transcript by Shopify, or the earnings call. Some analysts asked him about how is Shopify putting in effort to ramp up their Shopify shipping, or their what we call the kind of like Shopify the delivery of the goods, because Shopify is helping customers to also Shopify fulfillment. And his answer was, in business, the scarcest resource is actually not money, it's actually attention. So it's like mic drop line, right? And then he goes on to show, so in Shopify, it's actually we place a lot of emphasis on how we devote attention to different projects, and then blah blah blah. I forgot the actual thing that he talked about, but yeah, just stuff like that allows you to understand how he thinks, so you learn something from that. Number 2, which is this one, is it's such a mind blower for me when I first learned it from Michael Shen, and that is the best CEOs or founders, they are actually solving centric and not selling centric, which was was such an amazing moment for me, because it gave you a framework whenever, and it's so true, right? So Michael shares that when you look at founders, you want to ask yourself, when they are answering the analyst questions or they are doing an interview with a host, do they speak in language that tries to solve problems for their customers, or are they speaking in languages of trying to upsell and trying to cross-sell or trying to sell something? And you notice a big difference. Of course, I won't name companies here, but there are some companies where you listen to the earnings calls, it's still a great business, but the CEO is just a bit more salesy. When the analysts ask questions, they will answer like, oh yes, not to worry, we have another 3 products in the pipeline that we are ready to roll out to increase the average order value, what have you. Whereas the great founders, which is mainly your, of course I'm using extreme examples here, your Tobys, your Elons, or your Reed Hastings, what have you, when the analysts ask them questions about what's the market size of this product or the potential of the next item in the pipeline, yes, while they'll also address the product, but the languaging will be very different. They're always, yeah, we have this blah 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 item in the pipeline, and we are so excited because we know that it's going to be able to help more e-commerce sellers reduce friction in their checkout process, what have you. So we're just giving an example there, but yeah, so the languaging is different, even though they could still be talking about the same thing. Yeah, so that's kind of solving centric versus selling centric. And then the last one is I just like to look for founders that have a little bit of that weird way of what we call that idiosyncratic way of looking at the world. So I think a very known classic example is your Steve Jobs, right, and his ability to just suck people in. But Elon Musk is another one. And so I won't go too much into detail in this because it's a bit more intangible, but I like to look at different ways of looking at the world. So some examples would be, even though I don't own these companies, but it gave me a lens to look at it. Example, Reed Hastings, right? Reed Hastings, what's different about the way he looks at the world? The way he builds the Netflix culture. We are a sports team, we're not a family. His well-known culture deck. So it's a very different way of looking at the world. Toby Lutke, same thing. We are here to actually arm the rebels. So that could be a marketing tagline, to be honest. But like through his interviews, I realized that, it's actually not just a marketing tagline. This guy is dead serious about it. He wants to be able to create a world where people are not relying on Amazon, and he's done serious about doing this. And if you actually follow his Twitter, Toby Lutke, I believe last year when Shopify or when COVID-19 hit, he made a tweet that went viral that he's transitioning the whole Shopify into a complete remote workforce very early on. So all these different lenses of looking at the world, I like to have these kinds of weird founders, maybe because I'm weird myself, that I find a bit interesting, because I realize that's where the most alpha comes from, because the market isn't ready for it yet in the short term. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
No, that's a perfect answer. I love it. Maybe we'll change lanes to finish up with, but you started your Twitter in May last year and you already have 10,000 followers. So what's your secret sauce? Tell me everything, because I need to know.
Yeah, cheers. So to give, I think, full disclosure on the timeline, so I started it in May last year because that was the period where it was the renaissance, like I mentioned. So I was just using Twitter to learn more about investing. When I chanced upon the world of FinTwit, I was just blown away. But I didn't really start using Twitter then, as in I didn't really start posting anything because my usual style, I'm pretty low profile by nature. I don't really like the limelight, what have you. Since young, I've just never really liked attention on me. And so I was an empty account, 0 followers. My whole profile was full of retweets because it's private. So I just retweeted the stuff. So it's kind of like a place for me to collect good tweets or good information about companies that I follow. It was only in around August this year, I was having a conversation with a few friends and a few mentors, and I told them, hey, I love investing so much. I don't know whether you can relate to this, right, Kalani? I love it. I just eat, breathe, live, sleep analyzing companies. But whenever I talk to my close friends about it, they are good friends, they can relate, they will encourage you, but I could never feel that level of intellectual connection, whatever you call it. And so I think the word to use was, I was very intellectually lonely deep down. And I'm not saying this to make myself sound smart, whatever, but it's just I couldn't connect on the ideal level. And so my friend and my mentors just told, Max, why not just go post stuff on Twitter? And then I'm like, are you serious? Like Twitter, like who knew social media can cure this? I'm like, and they're like, just give it a shot. So in early September, I opened the account. I deleted all the past retweets and changed it over to the bookmark so I can still keep it. And then I started posting my ideas, my thought processes, and the books that I read. So to be fair, that's actually how I started, just about 3 months back, because now it's December, right? 3 months back. And yeah, that's how I kind of met Eugene and a few other local investors, and I think investors like yourself as well, Kalani, through the platform.
Yeah, and that's the best bit about it, isn't it? Same thing. The people you meet along the way is just unreal.
Exactly. Oh, sorry, I realized I didn't answer your question. Pardon me. I went tangent. You were asking for the secret sauce, right? Okay, yeah. The secret sauce, actually, believe it or not, it's actually not so much in me being like a really smart person, what have you. It's actually in my note-taking process. So, because other than you, there were a few people who actually DM'd me privately to ask, like, how do you build the account from 0 to 10k in like 2 months, 3 months? And I actually showed them like a screenshot or whatever. Because over the last 3 years of, like I mentioned, I'm a reading junkie. So every time I read, I use a Kindle, I highlight the notes and I extract the highlights into a Google Doc. So even before I came onto Twitter, I already had a Google Doc of like, I think close to 1,000 pages of notes, highlights from different articles, letters, fund manager write-ups, in that Google Doc that's sorted by headings, which is the different chapters or the different types of investors. And so what I'm doing on Twitter is just mainly, if I'm thinking of something, or I want to recall something that I learned, I go back, I read that from my Google Doc, and if in that moment it inspires me, I'll just take the whole chunk, rephrase it in my own words, and I'll just post it on Twitter. So actually that makes it look really easy, but actually because I have that second brain, what have you, of like 1,000 words in Google Docs, so that allows me to produce content pretty easily. But that's the secret.
Yeah, easily, but there's a lot of back work involved to get 1,000 pages. That's unreal. So yeah, what are your favourite sources to maybe read, or newsletters or books? Like what jumps to mind that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about maybe not investing and then investing first, because I think there's quite a few similarities to it. So I think what really inspired me when I was a younger kid to kind of want to pursue a better life for myself, to just threw me down the rabbit hole of growing and development. The first book I ever read was Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins, but that's pretty old school and classic, so I won't go there. A few books that have made a big impact on me was these two books. Number one is this book known as, I believe, if I'm not getting it wrong, How I Failed at Everything and Still Succeeded. It's by this guy known as Scott Adams. Scott Adams is the creator of the Dilbert comic, he's extremely pro-Trump, but we'll not talk about that now. But he's an amazing psychologist, right? And the biggest takeaway I got from that book was that two things. Number one, losers set goals, winners create systems. So he was basically saying that, in life, don't just set a goal, but build a system to make the goal a reality. But the even bigger takeaway I got from him was that in life, you don't just want to go all in on one skill. So instead of trying to be the best at something, aim to build multiple skills and then combine that talent stack to make yourself unique in the workplace or your career. And that really worked out well for me in my career as a marketer, as a speaker. So that played a big role in my career that allowed me to build that income and that savings needed to then invest it and grow my wealth. And the second book that had a big impact on me was this book known as So Good They Can't Ignore You. It's by this author known as Cal Newport. The essence of it is he covers this thing known as craftsmanship, which just jibes with me a lot. Like everything in life that you want to do, instead of focusing on the outcomes, focus on becoming a master at your craft. Get really good, because when you're really good, the results, whether it's autonomy, whether it's wealth, it's income, it's attention, fame, what have you, will all come naturally. But focus on the process. So he taught me the idea of learning how to fall in love with boredom and just fall in love with the journey. So those things, I think, form a foundational bedrock, even though, like I mentioned, it has nothing to do with investing. But those are the same core tenets that I take into everything that I do. So it's like in investing, I want to grow as an investor. Okay, day in, day out, build the craftsmanship mentality of reading annual reports, looking at earnings transcripts, build that I would say the skill set to be a good investor, rather than focus on the returns, which is a lagging indicator. So those are the two books. As for investing, I think it's mainly 3 books I recommend. Number one is Joys of Compounding by Gautam Bate. I believe everyone knows this right now, so I won't spend too much time there. It's just an amazing 500-page book, which sounds scary, but he's able to distill all the best concepts from the best investors like Lynch, Buffett, Munger, all into one. So that's number one. That's the first book. Second book is actually this book known as The Education of a Value Investor, which is by Guy Spear. What I took away from that was the importance of your environment. So Guy Spear likes to share that, when he first became a fund manager, he moved his family all the way to Zurich, and in a very quiet part of Zurich instead of New York because he wanted to be away from all that noise. It's a bit similar to Buffett being Omaha as compared to Wall Street. So he was also the person that first taught me that I should never look at stock prices every day, and that's what I learned from him. Third one is actually not a book, but I would say it can classify as a book due to its length. It's actually The Nomad Letters by Nick Sleep. I think any investor that really wants to understand ownership mentality and how do you actually hold something over the long term has to read Nick Sleep's letters, because we all know his main concentrated holdings are Berkshire, Costco and Amazon back in the days, right? So I think that gave me a lot of inspiration as to how I want to have my own investing philosophy. How do I want to pursue it? That gave me a lot of inspiration, a lot of ideas.
Maybe to move into my closing round of questions, what's the most undervalued life experience that university age students don't give weight to? Like, what do you think is an underrated skill or an experience maybe that they should have?
I would say a skill that has served me really well, at least for my career, but I'm not sure how relevant this would be for slightly different career paths, is the ability to write to persuade. So when I was a lot younger, like I mentioned, due to my marketing background, I spent, I think, years learning this skill known as copywriting. So I learned how to write to sell. So there were copywriting greats back in the days like Gary Halbert, John Carlton, a few of these well-known direct mail marketers that I learned from. That gave me the chops needed to be able to persuade people through my writing, and it's so useful in a career and even outside a career in a business you're building, like whether you're writing a Twitter post, a blog article, a landing page to sell an information product or a podcast, whatever. There's always elements of how do you write a headline, what's a hook, what's a bullet point. That really served me well. But that's why I asked the question, because I learned that while in university, but not in university. So my point was, I learned that when I was in my early 20s, which is I was in university, but I didn't learn that from a university class. So I'm not sure whether that fully answers the question, but I think to kind of throw in a little of my own spin on it, I think a very underrated, I don't know whether you call it a skill, but a very underrated, undervalued concept that most people should learn, and I think it's extremely crucial for wealth building in the later years. And as trite as this sounds, is the ability to save money. I know it sounds so stupid, like, okay, come on, give me something better, but I would say my investing returns and my results, I would not be able to get to where I am. And as much as I like to say, oh, I'm a great investor, I think honestly, my track record is too short. It could just be luck. But I would not have been able to hit my level of wealth or financial freedom if not for the big capital base I built through saving. And looking back, I realized it was two lessons that I unintentionally picked up. Number one, live like a student. It sounds extremely lame, but even after I got out from university, because I wasn't yet married, I was still single, I lived like a student. So you eat simple, you really cut your expenses. That builds the habit of constantly building up the nest egg, which will come in handy when you have investing skills to actually combine with it, and then you see accelerated returns. Number two, and that's something crucial I think I unintentionally picked up as well, the circle of friends that you surround with matters a lot. And I'm not saying this just from who you surround yourself with will become your average standard. No, what I'm saying is the people you surround yourself with will affect your spending appetite, will affect what you deem as okay or not okay, because it either creates in you excessive levels of desire for lavishness, excess, or wealth, what have you, or it teaches you to be humble. So I was always very mindful of, even though yes, I was also a pretty wild child, would go to clubs and bars in my younger days, but I would always have the internal compass that I want to be very mindful. If I spend too much time around people who either drive nice cars as a student, who go to bars and clubs every weekend, I'm gonna have my internal standards raised as to what's an expected level of comfort. This means I'm gonna be eating at nice fine places, want to buy cars as well, and that will affect my ability to save, which affects my ability to build wealth in the later years. So even till today, I think that's what I've learned in university just through observation. Those two things, like saving in terms of who I hang out with, has actually played a big role in my wealth accumulation, which I think is important to build when you're in university.
And in terms of you, like, what plans or visions do you have for the next 5-10 years? I know it's sometimes goals, but You're working in marketing now. Like, yeah, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, okay, I have a terrible answer for this. I don't really have a specific goal. I know most investors want to have like, hey, I'm going to hit my first 10 million, my first billion, whatever. I don't have any of those. And it's same thing. So sorry, I'm going to totally butcher your question here, but it's really because of the books that have a big influence on my life. That is, I don't really set goals. I focus more on habits and systems. So I'm very mindful of my daily routine. That's why I put more effort into as compared to the goal. So stuff like reading, learning, exercise, what have you, all these things are crucial. And number two, it's really down to the craftsman mentality. Anything that I want to do, I want to focus on getting great at the skill, whether it's being great at analyzing businesses, whether it's getting good at reading an annual report, what have you. I want to focus on those inputs and get really good and learn to enjoy that, and then the results will come. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, Kalani, I don't have any goals specifically for myself at this point. Yeah.
No, that's fine. And yeah, before we wrap up, anything you want to plug? Where can people find you?
So nothing really much to plug because I'm still working 9 to 5, right? So I'm not like running my own fund, what have you. So you can find me on Twitter, where my handle is Hey Max Koh, HeyMaxKoh. I tweet about stuff that inspires me, my investing philosophies, journey, and just in general, even stuff not related to investing, but just makes me really excited. I'll just share it. So that's about it. More than happy to chat, DM, and just connect with like-minded investors and people.
Yeah, Max, thank you so much for being on. I've learned a ton, and I really appreciate your time and effort today. So cheers.
Thank you, Kalani, for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast episode, be sure to check out the website compoundingpodcast.com. On the website, you'll find every episode complete with transcripts, show notes, and other related resources. If you want an email notification every time an episode releases, plus my lessons and takeaways from each episode, be sure to sign up to the Substack. So that's compoundingcuriosity.substack.com. Either way, links to all content mentioned today will be in the description below, and you can also connect with me on Twitter @ScarrettKalani. But until next time, have a good one.